This film is not really fiction. Every terrible thing that happens in it happened first to a real young woman in a real Vietnamese village, and the only reason anyone ever found out was because one soldier refused to stay silent. This is Casualties of War, Brian De Palma's 1989 drama starring Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn, based on a true 1966 atrocity committed by an American patrol during the Vietnam War. Today, we look at 15 facts about how this film came to be made, the true case that inspired it, and what ultimately happened to the real people involved, both the man who spoke up and the men he testified against. Subscribe if you want more serious film history like this. Let's get into it. Every major event in Casualties of War is drawn directly from something that actually took place. In November 1966, a five-man American patrol in Vietnam's Central Highlands kidnapped a young Vietnamese woman named Phan Thi Mao from her village. Four of the five men took turns raping her over the following day. When the patrol came under fire from Viet Cong forces and the men grew afraid she would be discovered, two of them stabbed and then shot her to death. Only one member of the patrol, Private First Class Robert Storby, refused to take part in the assault. Despite reported threats against his life from the other men, Storby reported the crime to his superiors, who initially did nothing. His persistence eventually forced a formal investigation. That true story, first uncovered and reported by journalist Daniel Lang for The New Yorker in 1969, is the entire basis for the film. The names were changed and some details altered, but the essential events, kidnapping, assault, and murder, happened almost exactly as depicted. Lang's article was expanded into a full book the same year, and it remains, decades later, one of the most carefully documented accounts of a war crime committed by American forces during the Vietnam conflict, built largely from courts-martial transcripts and testimony given by the men who took part. Lang himself spent years gaining access to sealed military records and tracking down participants willing to speak on the record, work that gave the resulting article an unusually thorough legal and factual foundation for a piece of magazine journalism covering an incident the Army had initially preferred to keep quiet. When Daniel Lang wrote his original 1969 article, the case was still under a degree of legal and journalistic sensitivity, so he gave the victim and the soldiers pseudonyms to protect the parties involved. By the time Brian De Palma made his film 2 decades later, the real names, including the victim's actual name, Phan Thi Mao, had already become part of the public record through subsequent reporting and court documents. De Palma and screenwriter David Robb chose to keep Lang's original invented names anyway, calling the character Tran Thi Oang in the film rather than her real name. This was a deliberate choice to maintain a layer of separation between the historical record and the dramatized version, even though anyone who researched the case afterward could easily learn who she really was. It reflects a persistent tension in how this story has been told across 5 decades, between honoring the facts and protecting the memory of a real person who never consented to becoming a symbol. This choice also extended to the soldiers themselves. Every man in the patrol is given an invented name in the film, even the ones whose real identities had likewise become part of the public record through news coverage and legal proceedings that stretched across more than 2 decades before the film's release. The real perpetrators served far less time than the film suggests. Casualties of War ends with the courts-martial and convictions of the men responsible, which plays as a form of justice delivered. The real history is considerably bleaker. While the 4 soldiers involved were initially convicted, with sentences including life imprisonment, nearly every one of those sentences was dramatically reduced on appeal in the years that followed. The soldier who committed the actual stabbing and shooting had his life sentence commuted first to 20 years, then reduced again to 8, making him eligible for parole after only 4. Another soldier had his 15-year sentence and dishonorable discharge entirely reversed on appeal after a court ruled his confession had been obtained in violation of his constitutional rights. A third man's sentence was cut down to under 2 years. By the early 1970s, most of the men convicted in the case were already free. The film does not show any of this, ending instead on the moment of conviction rather than what came after. Historians who have studied the case since have pointed to this pattern of reduced sentencing as part of a broader reluctance within the military justice system of that era to hold soldiers fully accountable for crimes committed against Vietnamese civilians, a reluctance that extended well beyond this single case. One soldier's dishonorable discharge and sentence were reversed entirely on appeal after a court determined his original confession had been obtained improperly, meaning the legal record in that instance effectively erased any formal accounting of his role in the crime, a detail that has troubled legal scholars who have revisited the case since. The soldier who carried out the actual killing of Phan Thi Mao did not fade quietly from public record after his release. In 1992, more than 2 decades after his court-martial, he gained fresh notoriety when he was charged as an accessory in the trial of a different murder, the racially motivated killing of an African-American sailor stationed on an American naval vessel. At the time of this second case, the former soldier was reportedly a member of a white supremacist organization alongside the man on trial for the killing itself. Court records indicate he ultimately received a lenient probationary sentence in exchange for his testimony. A striking outcome for a man who had already once escaped the fuller consequences of a violent crime decades earlier. It is a grim postscript that rarely gets mentioned, alongside discussions of the film, a reminder that the man responsible for one of the crimes the movie dramatizes went on, years later, to be connected to another act of racially motivated violence. Film scholars who have examined the case in detail have pointed to this later chapter as evidence that the original crime was never an isolated aberration in the man's character, but part of a broader and more disturbing pattern that persisted long after his military service and his conviction had both ended. Brian De Palma's version was not the first attempt to bring this story to the screen, nor even the second. Long before he became involved, the film rights to Daniel Lang's reporting were purchased by producer David Suskind, who intended to make the film for Warner Brothers with a screenplay by journalist and novelist Pete Hamill and direction by the acclaimed British filmmaker Jack Clayton. That version never came together, and the rights eventually reverted. In the meantime, 2 other filmmakers separately dramatized the same true incident using their own approaches. A West German film called OK was released in 1970, and a 1972 American drama called The Visitors, directed by the celebrated filmmaker Elia Kazan, also drew on the same case. By the time De Palma's version reached theaters in 1989, this single true crime had already inspired 3 separate feature films across nearly 2 decades, in 3 different countries. The involvement of a filmmaker as respected as Elia Kazan in an earlier attempt underscores just how seriously this case was taken within the film industry from very early on, even though none of these prior versions found anything close to the lasting recognition that De Palma's eventual film would receive. Both earlier films are relatively obscure today, largely overshadowed by the De Palma version, but their existence shows that this true story was already recognized as urgent, difficult material worth dramatizing on screen well before Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn were ever attached to it. Playwright David Rabe first brought the project to Brian De Palma's attention in 1979, and De Palma was immediately interested, but simply could not secure financing for material this dark and unflinching. The two came close once, attaching Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn to star and nearly closing a deal with Paramount Pictures, only for that deal to collapse when the budget crept upward and the studio got cold feet. De Palma went on to direct the massive hit The Untouchables in the years that followed, and it was that commercial success that finally gave him the leverage to get Casualties of War made elsewhere. Dawn Steele, newly installed as head of production at Columbia Pictures, chose it as the very first film she personally greenlit in that role, betting on De Palma's track record to carry a project every other studio had turned away. Steele later noted that Vietnam War films had historically performed well commercially, citing the success of Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and Apocalypse Now as evidence the genre could find an audience, even for material this uncompromising. That commercial reasoning ultimately proved only partly correct. The finished film received largely positive reviews from critics upon release, but it underperformed at the box office, earning less than its production budget during its theatrical run, a result that some observers attributed to audiences being unwilling to sit through a war film built around sexual violence and murder rather than combat action. Actor Stephen Baldwin was originally cast in the role of Herbert Hatcher, one of the soldiers in the patrol, and began filming alongside Sean Penn and the rest of the cast. Only a few days into production, Baldwin was let go from the role, a sudden and largely unexplained departure at the time that left the rest of the cast and crew to simply carry on without him. He has since suggested the firing followed a disagreement with De Palma after he questioned a creative choice involving Penn's use of an accent for the role. Baldwin was quickly replaced by John C. Reilly, who at the time was simply on location working as an extra in the background of other scenes. Reilly stepped into the recast role and delivered what became his official screen debut, launching a long career that would eventually include reuniting with Sean Penn on more than one later project. Baldwin, meanwhile, still appears briefly in a handful of unnamed background shots left over from before his dismissal. A strange footnote in which an actor fired from a role can still technically be glimpsed on screen in the finished film, credited nowhere and playing no one in particular. Alongside John C. Reilly's unplanned debut, Casualties of War also gave an early, pivotal role to a young actor named John Leguizamo, cast as the squad's newest member, Diaz. It was his first significant film part, playing a character caught between conscience and peer pressure within the patrol. Leguizamo's work in the film led directly to a lasting professional relationship with both De Palma and Penn. Several years later, he reunited with both men on the 1993 crime drama Carlito's Way, another De Palma picture, this time in a considerably more prominent role. It is a rare case of a single, difficult production quietly launching two significant film careers at once. Reilly's through an unplanned recasting, and Leguizamo's through a deliberate early opportunity, both of them stepping into a story built around the darkest possible material. Leguizamo's character, Diaz, is written as the one member of the squad who is pressured into joining the assault against his own instincts, a role that demanded a young, largely untested actor carry some of the film's most morally complicated material in only his first significant screen appearance. Both Reilly and Leguizamo went on to become defining character actors of their generation, and it is a striking piece of film history that two performers who would each build decades-long careers first appeared together on the same difficult, low-key production, largely unnoticed at the time by anyone outside the cast and crew. This film deals with a real atrocity and its real human cost, and the facts behind it are worth sitting with. If any of this touches on something difficult for you personally, please know that support is available, and I'm glad to point toward resources if that would help. Alright, let's continue. The role of the kidnapped woman at the center of the story, called Oon in the film, was played by an actress named Thuy Thu Lo. It remains, to this day, her only credited film role. She does not have an extensive filmography before or after Casualties of War, making this singular, harrowing performance the entirety of her screen legacy. Given the difficulty and gravity of what the role demanded, this is a striking fact in itself. An actress with no other credits took on one of the most emotionally punishing parts in any film of the decade, portraying a woman based on a real victim of a real crime, and then, by all available public record, never appeared on screen again. Whatever her reasons, her performance remains the only visible trace of her acting career, inseparable from the true story the film was built to honor. Critics at the time singled out her performance for its restraint, noting that she was tasked with conveying fear, dignity, and eventual resignation almost entirely through physical presence, since the character's dialogue is deliberately limited throughout much of the film's central sequence. Rather than filming in Vietnam itself, the production shot almost entirely on location in Thailand, whose jungles and rural landscapes stood in for the Vietnamese Central Highlands, where the actual events took place. Additional scenes were filmed back in San Francisco for the story's framing device, in which an older Erickson recalls the events as a haunting memory. One filming location carries a particularly notable history of its own. A bridge sequence in the film was shot in Kanchanaburi, Thailand, at the very same location used decades earlier for the famous bridge on the River Kwai. That earlier film was, of course, also a story about the moral cost of war, meaning Casualties of War quietly shares physical ground with one of cinema's other defining meditations on conscience under military command. The choice of Thailand as a stand-in for Vietnam was a common practice for American productions of this era, since filming in Vietnam itself remained politically and logistically impossible only a little more than a decade after the war's end. The production also filmed additional interior and framing sequences back in San Francisco, giving the finished film a structure that moves between the humid, densely forested landscapes of Southeast Asia and the comparatively muted, overcast streets of an American city where Erickson now lives, haunted by what happened half a world and more than 20 years away. Michael J. Fox has spoken about how difficult a shoot this was, playing a young soldier who spends much of the film in a state of moral horror at what his own squad is doing. According to accounts from the production, Sean Penn, deeply committed to inhabiting his character's aggressive, domineering presence, would reportedly needle Fox off camera, telling him he was little more than a television actor, apparently as a deliberate tactic to provoke a genuine, unguarded reaction during their scenes together. Fox, whose career up to that point had largely been defined by lighter, more comedic roles, has described the experience as genuinely challenging in ways separate from the technical demands of the role itself. Whatever the exact nature of the exchanges between the two actors, the tension in their scenes together, one man radiating menace and control, the other radiating fear and refusal, reads as entirely convincing on screen. De Palma reportedly encouraged this dynamic rather than intervening, believing that a genuine sense of intimidation between the two men on set would translate directly into the power imbalance the story required between their characters, a squad leader and the private who dared to defy him. The film's music was composed by the legendary Italian composer Ennio Morricone, already famous by this point for decades of iconic film scores. His work on Casualties of War earned a Golden Globe nomination for Best Original Score, a notable honor for a film that otherwise struggled to find a wide audience. Morricone's score for this film sits in an unusual place within his own body of work, restrained and somber where some of his most famous compositions are sweeping and operatic. It underlines the film's tone without ever calling attention to itself, a deliberate choice suited to material this grave. The recognition it receives stands as one of the clearer signs that, even as the film underperformed commercially, elements of its craft were taken seriously by the industry at the time. Morricone and De Palma had collaborated closely just 2 years earlier on The Untouchables, and this quieter, more mournful follow-up score shows a very different side of that partnership, trading bold percussive themes for something closer to a lament. The theatrical version of Casualties of War that audiences saw in 1989 ran a lean 113 minutes. Years later, in 2006, an extended cut was released on home video, running roughly 6 minutes longer and restoring 2 scenes that had been trimmed from the original theatrical version. Both of the restored scenes take place during the court-martial sequence toward the end of the film, expanding on the legal proceedings against the men responsible for the crime. Their inclusion gives audiences a somewhat fuller picture of the judicial aftermath depicted in the story, even though, as covered earlier, the real judicial aftermath extended well beyond anything either cut of the film actually shows, given how substantially the real sentences were reduced in the years that followed the actual case. The extended cut has since become the preferred version for many film scholars studying the picture, offering a slightly more complete legal framework around the crime without altering any of the film's central events. Neither cut, however, includes any indication of the reduced sentences the real men actually served, meaning even the fuller version of the film still leaves audiences with a considerably more resolved sense of justice than the historical record supports. Screenwriter David Rubb and director Brian De Palma reportedly disagreed most sharply over how the film should end. In the finished movie, Erickson, now home and haunted by what he witnessed, encounters a young Vietnamese American woman on a train who bears a resemblance to the woman who was killed. She reassures him that whatever he is remembering was only a bad dream, and that it is over now. Rabe has said he wanted something simpler and quieter, envisioning a scene in which Erickson would simply help the young woman carry her groceries, without the more overt acknowledgement of his trauma that De Palma ultimately filmed. De Palma held firm, and it is his ending, not Rabe's, that closes the release film. That disagreement was part of a longer, more complicated relationship Rabe had with the finished picture. For years afterward, he reportedly felt uncertain whether the adaptation had done justice to material he was so personally invested in. In later years, his feelings shifted considerably. He has since spoken with real warmth about the film, describing the effort it took De Palma and producer Don Steele to get such difficult material made at all as an act of near heroism, and saying that watching it again decades later left him genuinely moved and proud of what reached the screen. Rabe has described the film as containing striking sequences of direction and filmmaking that he had not fully appreciated on first viewing, a rare public reconsideration from a writer who had once been ambivalent about how his own words had translated to the screen. The most sobering fact of all is not something the filmmakers invented, but something they chose to leave out. Casualties of War closes on the convictions of the men responsible, a moment that reads, understandably, as a form of accountability finally being reached. The true history tells a harder story. As covered earlier, nearly every sentence handed down in the real case was significantly reduced within a few short years, through appeals, legal technicalities, and a military justice system that, by most historical accounts, was reluctant to fully reckon with what had happened. The one man who refused to participate and who reported the crime at genuine personal risk. The real inspiration from Michael J. Fox's character saw the men he testified against walk free far sooner than any conviction suggested they would. The film gives its audience the comfort of a clear ending. The true story, as is so often the case, offered no such resolution. Only a young woman's death, a system slow to respond, and consequences that quietly faded years before anyone in the audience of this film was watching. It is worth remembering that fact whenever a film based on a true story ends on a note of justice served, since the real world rarely closes its books so neatly, and the people who lived through the actual event are left carrying whatever the story left out. So there you have it. 15 facts about a film built entirely from a true and terrible story. One that took nearly a decade to reach the screen and ends on a note of justice that the real history never actually delivered. It remains one of the most unflinching American films about the Vietnam War precisely because it refuses to look away from what a small group of men were capable of doing to one person who had no way to stop them. If this film or its true story affected you, that is a reasonable response, and it is always worth talking to someone you trust about it. Subscribe for more serious film history. Until next time, take care of yourselves.